There we go. Yes, please.
Okay.
Right. We are online now and we're going live. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. Right. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for your patience. Today we have two guests. Unfortunately, Peter couldn't make it. Peter is undergoing an operation today, so we are thinking about him today, and he's in our thoughts and prayers, as they say. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just perhaps a little bit more about the two guests that we do have online. I'll start ladies first. I'll start with Hela. Hela, welcome. Both David and Hela are from Toronto. And Hela is an internationally recognized expert on sustainable business practices. She has a 30-year record of turning environmental, social, and governance, or ESG risks, into innovative, profitable business opportunities. And I'm not going to go through her whole profile, but Hela is the CEO of Competent Boards, and Competent Boards runs training programs on climate and ESG competent boards, but also for executives. So welcome to Hela. Thank you very much. And we also have online David Beattie. David is part of the Rotman faculty. He's a professor. He's got lots of credentials. He spent, and I'm not going to age you, David, quite a while managing one of North America's largest food companies. So he's very practical, but he also has the academic background, and he teaches a lot on corporate strategy and corporate governance. So we've got the two experts here today to talk to us about corporate governance in Canada. And maybe just to answer some questions that I put towards Peter Day. With Peter not being able to be here today, I put some questions to him before the time, and I asked him specifically about his reports on corporate governance, which are really quite significant reports, and really setting the scene for corporate governance in Canada. So we know that there was regulations that went out, but Peter published his first report in 1994, which is quite significant from my being in South Africa, because we also published our first King report in 1994. And I asked him, what was the motivation behind this report? So I'd just like to read his answer out. So he said the motivation of the report, and it's called Where Were the Directors, was based on a number of corporate failures. And of course, this also inspired the title of the report. The concern addressed in the report was the failure of boards of directors to understand their duties as directors. The report provided guidelines for constructing an effective system of governance, which we expected would upgrade the quality of governance in Canadian corporations. The report was sponsored by the Toronto Stock Exchange, which required listed companies to comply with the governance guidelines or explain the reasons for not complying. And it's interestingly, that's where the King reports in South Africa started as well, was the comply or explain. So when implemented of box ticking, which we found with these kinds of standards, and Peter interestingly said, until the market equated good governance with value creation, which is interesting. After settling, we found that corporations generally committed to upgrading their governance systems. But interestingly, he said there was a second motivation for this first report. And this motivation was a desire to maintain and enhance the attractiveness of Canada's capital markets. In Canada, Peter said, we were very much aware of what was going on in other markets, and particularly the impact of the Cadbury report on Western capital markets. And that Cadbury report, of course, came out of the United Kingdom. And he said there was recognition that to remain competitive in Canada, Canada needed to conduct a study of the governance systems of Canadian corporations and make recommendations for improvements. And certainly that did happen, and that, as they say, did come to pass. So then I asked Peter, well, why did Canada need a second report if that was so successful? So he said, to be clear, I think you're referring to the report titled 360-Degree Governance. Where are the directors in a world in crisis? So it wasn't actually a second report, which was interesting. He said This report was actually co-authored by myself, Peter, and Sarah Kaplan. And Sarah being a distinguished professor of gender and economy and professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. He said, if there was a need for this report, it was a need which Sarah and I felt. It wasn't sponsored by any public or regulatory body, which was unlike, of course, the first report. What really brought Sarah and me together was an essay that Sarah wrote, which was published in Canada's national newspaper, referring to the well-known statement of the US Business Roundtable about the purpose of the corporation, which was published in August 2019. So all of those working in corporate governance, you remember that report. And that was seminal in talking about the move from the shareholder supremacy or primacy of the shareholder to more stakeholder inclusive approach. And that statement to that effect said that the purpose of the corporation should be to benefit all stakeholders and not simply to create value for the corporation's shareholders. He said in Sarah's essay, she asked where Canada stood on the transition to stakeholder primacy from shareholder primacy. And then he responded by outlining the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in a landmarked BCE case, which made it clear that the board's responsibility is to act in the best interests of the corporation. And in doing so, the board could take into account the interests of its full range of stakeholders. In the course of the dialogue that Peter had with Sarah, Sarah actually proposed an update to the 1994 report. And Peter said this was timely because the pandemic had struck and boards were having to make tough decisions relating to the management of all corporation stakeholders, of course, with the pandemic. The result was Sarah and my report, which sets out guidelines for boards on a range of issues from corporate purpose, Indigenous people, diversity, climate change, and those kinds of things. These were the issues that were highlighted by the pandemic and other forces, and we proposed guidelines describing the processes, the methodologies in which boards should engage to address these issues. And he said the book is still open on how well boards are responding to these issues and to the broader shift to stakeholder primacy. So thank you very much to Peter in absentia for your comments and your answers to these questions. But now I'd like to go to David, because David really is in the throes of the practicalities of these kinds of statements of good practice. So from your perspective, David, how are corporates doing and directors doing in the face of the pandemic and these kind of issues?
Well, if I could just back up a little bit, can you see that?
Yes, that looks good.
Yeah. Canada is ranked #1 in terms of the quality of its corporate governance. And a large part of that comes from Peter Day's first report and the consciousness raised by the second report that he and Sarah have just written. But you'll see that by ISS, they value the corporate governance in Canada much higher than any other nation listed on this chart. And there are 4 reasons for that. And I just thought I'd run through it with you. In 2004, the asset managers came together and created something called the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. And I was its first managing director. And we began by setting out best practices. What do we think practically should a board of directors do? For example, split the chair and CEO. And today that has $3 trillion in assets under management and 50 members and is still going strong. The second thing we did is we published in our national newspaper a measurement system on how things were going. So we measured over 80 parameters for 250 publicly traded companies. So we had a carrot and a stick. Here are the best practices if you want to think about them. But if you don't, we're going to measure you anyhow and publish that annually in our newspaper. And this is where we started in about 2002, the distribution of governance scores as we measured it at the Rotman School. And you'll see it's fairly flat. There's some great ones and there's some perfectly awful ones. Fast forward to 2021, you can see there's a much higher concentration of those companies we deem to have good governance scores, and much less on the lower left-hand side. There's still 68 that could do some improvements, but they're not catastrophic anymore. So that was our 20th year of doing these ratings. So we've been at this for a long time now. The third thing we do is we have a director's education program together with the Institute of Corporate Directors. We've put through 8,000 people in partnership with 10 other universities across the country. It's a very demanding course. It's 12 days. That's 4 weekends of 3 days each, and is quite expensive as well. So that's what we've done. And thanks to the DEP, we continue to do that. And we celebrate achievement at annual award dinners. And the interesting thing about Canada is that the last one we had in Calgary had 1,000 people at it from right across the country, from Vancouver and Victoria to Newfoundland. And I've always hypothesized that if you were in the United States and had a dinner to celebrate a director and a director achievement, you might get 2 people come from Boston to New York. You get nobody from Chicago, and the people on the West Coast wouldn't even know there was a dinner on. So there's a great deal of social mobility in Canada that I don't think exists to the same extent in the United States. So these are the 4 reasons: we promulgate, we evaluate, we educate, and we celebrate. And those 4 combine, I think, to have given us this position, which I hope we can maintain. But in the face of all of these new forces, it's going to be a considerable and demanding task for Canadian directors. But that's where we are today, Carolyn. So I'll just maybe turn it over to Helle.
Thanks so much. Helle, from your perspective, is this what you're seeing from director education and the new topics that are coming to the fore?
Let me start by saying thank you for having me. And it's a great honor also to be here together with David. I've been in Canada for 10 years, so I'm an immigrant, I guess, to Canada. I'm now a dual citizen between Denmark and Canada. And yes, I work with board of directors from all over the world, including from Canada. And it's fantastic to see those slides that David is showing us. So what I focus on is what you might say, the things that are on the agenda at the moment: environment, social governance, climate, human rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we deal with shareholder and stakeholder expectations? How do we deal with tax, investment, and pay in a world that's focused on responsibility? So many of those different areas. And what I see is the same as David is saying, that I think I have a lot of those people, fantastic people that's been going through David's program or the ICT program, that then saying they're actually going through the ESG Competent Boards designation program and learn together with other leaders from around the world. And I think that's one of the things that clearly we have in David and the ICT program, fantastic insight from a Canadian perspective. What I've been trying to do is saying, how do we ensure that we understand what are the implications when we are a global business to actually what's happening around the world? How do we learn from that? How do we bring that into the boardroom so we can have the oversight, but also the foresight in terms of all of these issues? So I'm glad to see David, the fantastic and being number 1. That's one of the the good things around the world. Often we hear that Canadians, we are perhaps more humble than a lot, and not that many say they want to be number 1, but want to be number 2. So I'm glad, David, to see that as a that we have a number 1 space here.
We have a bit of dispute on the side where Patrice thinks that actually South Africa is number 1, but I'm hearing
well, that could be. I don't know. It could be true.
But
I
what
hope
I'm
that's
hearing
true.
is from, I think, in terms of behavior, director behavior, we see on the South African boards, perhaps the news isn't as good in terms of poor behavior of directors. And maybe a question to you, David: the programs that you run, can South African directors join your program? Would it be beneficial to join that kind of program?
Well, we now offer online Zoom courses independently of our in-person courses, and we've started our second one. And so, yes, it would be open to anybody, anywhere. We've had 2 or 3 South American directors join already, and I would welcome anybody from anywhere else in the world. It's the same 12-day course. It's just that it's delivered over Zoom in a little bit more manageable hunks, but it's the same professors, it's the same curriculum, and I think it adds the same value.
Thanks, David. So maybe then the point is, and I see we have a question here from Jabulani about the ethical issues. Maybe it's a question then of not, we were talking about that, not the doing bit, the learning how to be a director, but the actual being bit is being a director. Do you find that the cultural aspects make a difference in boards?
Well, my answer is yes. I mean, enormously. The legal context of many boards of directors is hugely different by country, depending on their legal system. And then the cultural aspects are hugely different. You compare, for example, Canada to the United Kingdom. Canada and the United States have this star system where the only person on the board, generally speaking, from the management suite is the CEO. In the UK, the tradition is to have about 40% of your board being C-suite executives. So you'd have your CEO, you'd have your CFO. In the case of Cadbury, Sir Adrian's company, you'd have the head of the drinks division and the head of the confectionery division. So you'd have 4 executive directors formally on the board of directors. That changes the entire context of how decisions are made in the C-suite and how discussions are held in the boardroom. So even with the common basis of English law, there's a huge differentiation in board structures and board practices. So in Australia, a staggered board is still very common, whereas in the United States, there's only 10% of the S&P 500 are staggered boards, and in Canada, there's virtually none. So there are tremendous differences. And then as you reach out beyond the English-based legal systems, you get even more differentiation. And Helle is an expert on Denmark. And tell us, Helle, what's different in Denmark than you might experience here in Canada?
Well, and I think to Denmark, for example, we have that there are employee elected board members. So that's one of the things. But I think to your point, David, and just in terms, and Caroline, in terms of the culture, that's why we have that the governance, there might be different things in terms of reporting, there might be disclosure, etc., from country to country. But in Caroline, you know that I wrote the book Stewards of the Future. And I think from a board of directors point of view, we need to not only talk about what's the purpose of the business, but what's the purpose of the board of directors? And that's clearly, you need to have, and David, you're teaching that, what are the governance rules and regulations from a Canadian point of view? That might be different if you go to Japan or if you go to other places. But the spirit in my mind, and that's, the good Mervyn King have that worked with for many years, and many of the other global board members that I'm working with, and we have over 150, board members that are contributing to the ESG Competent Boards Certificate and Designation programs. But that is to give that global insight and think about, yes, there are different cultures around the world. How do we learn to understand that? And then embed that into how we think. But as they probably would say, make sure that you're in compliance with the laws and regulations, of course, in those countries. But also that is changing at the moment. So we're seeing such a change around the world, not only in terms of disclosure, in terms of laws and regulations, but also what does good governance look like? And I think that's where I'm trying to say, how do we ensure that we get this stewards of the future mindset? And that's what we're seeing, that both employees, customers, stakeholders, and some shareholders, many shareholders actually want.
Thanks, Helle. So there's a question here about ethics in terms of directors' duties, but it sounds like there's quite a lot to do with the dynamics, the boardroom dynamics as well. As you're saying, Helle, in terms of, yes, there's the legislative, we've just have the UK governance reform package coming out. So there's all of that work from a legislative perspective. And it's interesting that the Canadian approach is also, we've got comply and explain. So we've got that need to have a mindful approach to compliance of the governance principles. But going back to the actual decision making, you're ticking all these boxes, you're applying your mind, But David, you got a fantastic story about a specific company in Japan where 1% shareholder actually has a huge influence on the decision-making in the boardroom.
Well, yes, the family, this is Yamazaki Baking, started by and now still run by Nobuhiro Ijima. And the Ijima family control the company today with 1% of the shares. They've given most of their shares to charity. But there's no asset manager in Japan that would attack that company for lack of financial performance, because the family strength is so ingrained in the culture. And Nobuhiro would tell you that my main job as the CEO, founders, and cultural head is the lifetime employment of my employees. That's my fundamental purpose in life. And yes, we make money as we go along, but if we don't make as much money as some of the investors think we ought to be doing, then they'll never attack us. You've got to be aware that in North America, the realpolitik of being a publicly traded company is colossal. There are over 800 activist attacks around the world last year, and they're not going away. In fact, they're accelerating. So if you don't perform economically, you will definitely be attacked as a board of directors in a widely held company by a bunch of shareholders who will then gather together, and they call them wolf packs, and they'll attack your company, and they often take it over. So even our bellwether Unilever, Paul Pullman, the hero of sort of a broader view of capitalism than just looking after the shareholder, his company, 2 years after his departure, is under attack by Nelson Peltz for precisely that, for focusing on things other than the stakeholder that's called the shareholder. And Nelson Peltz 2 days ago just got appointed to the Unilever board. So it's kind of a bellwether case. The child we all put forward is look at the future. This is Unilever, and Paul Pullman is being attacked and has been successfully attacked now by 2 activist funds who put one of their members on the board. So the realpolitik of being a widely held company in North America is that you've got to perform economically, or you will be picked off by one of these activist funds. And you'll be thrown out of office as a director, and the executive suite will disappear as well in most cases.
Wow. So there's huge pressure on directors to make decisions beyond just in the best interests of the company.
Well, listen, the Business Roundtable, 180 executives signed this piece of paper that said, yeah, we believe in a broader stakeholder definition of performance. The Harvard Law Review went through their results and their publications within 24 months and said, yes, they say one thing, but they're not doing it. So it's kind of, there's a nice beacon on the hill saying, do things differently, be aware of customers, suppliers, communities, all these wonderful things. And we all espouse it. And we are on the front page of the Fortune magazine. And there's all kinds of photographs of us. But in fact, according to the Harvard law professors, nothing happened, no change. So we say one thing, you do another, is where I think we are in North America. And in widely held corporations, that's because there are huge, huge costs if you don't, in the short term, meet your financial objectives. And compensation programs are heavily geared to stock prices in the United States, way beyond any other jurisdiction. So with the average CEO having 4.5 years to make his or her fortune, they're going to be looking at the share price as much as anybody is. And if they don't meet their quarterly earnings, they're going to be thrown out and their wealth will be decimated. And so they always make their quarterly earnings, and they'll keep doing that. The happy news, in a way, is the center of gravity of capitalism has moved out of capital markets. The number of publicly traded companies is down 50% in North America and in UK in the last 25 years. So the whole center of gravity of economic development's moved into private equity and venture capital, which is colossal. There's $3 trillion of unspent money. There's 6,000 companies who are private equity based. And you never read about it in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times because it's just not there. But the center of economic gravity of development and innovation is moved out of public markets almost completely and into the private equity sector. So you got to be looking at a lot more. If you're thinking about corporate governance now, you got to be thinking about private companies, you got to be thinking about family firms, you got to be thinking about private equity, venture capital, as well as publicly traded firms. It's now a hugely diverse landscape.
And we don't see, so when we created ISO 37000, the governance of organization standard. When we did our environmental scan, but this is way back in 2017, we looked at all the codes and standards and regulations across the world in respect of corporate governance, and most of them, by far the majority of them, were for the listed companies, for the listed entities. And so we didn't see governance codes generally beyond the listed companies or those requirements. So yes, inculcated in the legislation, in the Companies Acts, but nothing further than that generally for the general organization. So that's quite worrying in terms of not having that gap around corporate governance, or just the governance of an organization in terms of the how-to. Maybe if I can head over to Hella now. Hella, from your perspective, do you see the people who are joining your programs, are they from the listed entities? Are they non-listed entities? And are they able to make a difference given this new knowledge that you're giving them in their companies?
Yeah, so just to refer, so yes, we have people that are joining us from all continents around the world, not Antarctica, but apart from that, so we have people that's joining us from all over the world. And that board directors from public listed companies, from Fortune 500 companies, etc. And I hear the picture that David is painting, but I would say that might be the group that are getting less and less. And I think that it's important to say how it was, how it might be. But also, I think that more and more are looking to see how will it be in the future. So Paul Pullman, one of those that started competent boards with me, together with the chair of Unilever, but also many other leaders around the world, the chair of Maersk, the chair of Siemens, investors, etc. So we have, and talking about activist investors, I had the pleasure of also talking to the founder of Engine Number One. So I think we are seeing it a little bit like, oh, these are against us. Let's fight, instead of listening to what it is that they're saying. And I think that that's where a board of directors really can use their skills to see what is it. And we have this exercise, you can call it kill the company. What would you see if you were sitting outside? What could we change? But there are some fundamentals, values, and Carolyn, you know that we go through in every single module, we go through cases. And there are some fundamental values on what do you believe in? Do you believe in the, let's just create shareholder value for, the short term? Or do you want to create shareholder value for the long term? And I think that's where I definitely see the shift is coming. And for no other reason, I mean, employees nowadays, especially those, that's the future. The younger generation, they want to work in companies that have the values, same values as them. They don't want to work in companies that are part of the problem. They want to work in companies that are part of the solution. I meet board directors every single day. I have like 35 every single week that want to be part of that can see that they're being asked by their employees, they're being asked by shareholders, they're being asked by customers, they're being asked by their children, and frankly their grandchildren. Are you part of the problem or part of that? And I believe that that's our duty as board of directors. We have this fantastic responsibility as actually being the governance around the companies. So we need to be the ones that are setting that and not saying, oh, shareholders want us to do this, so let's do that. That's, to me, not being a steward of the future. We need to make sure that those board of directors that we have serving are there because they want to leave the company in a better place than they found it. And perhaps one more thing. In terms of private equity, Carlyle, one of the private equities funds, and I can say it because they put it in a press release, have asked us to train their board of directors of portfolio companies. They are also doing this because, I assume, because they know that also from a value creation point of view, this is the right way forward. There's no companies that can survive in a world that's failed. There's no company that can, if they say, well, we don't care about what's going on in terms of social issues, we don't care about what's going on in terms of environmental issues, climate issues, that will be very, very expensive, right? So it's a question about upfront invest and reap the benefits. Sorry, that was a long spiel.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Helle. What I'm loving about this conversation is that this is governance in Canada that we're talking about. And immediately in the first half an hour, we jumped to the perspective of how what's happening in the world. And I think that goes to the very culture of governance in Canada, is that you don't consider, there's not an internal only focus. You're actually looking at the Canadian organizations, the Canadian corporations operating in a global system, not just insular. We have had quite a few governance around the world's events already. And in those events, the people talk about, well, this is what's happening in my country, and this is what's happening in my country, and this is our approach. But on this call, immediately we went to, boom, this is how Canada fits in it from a global perspective. And I think that goes to the culture of Canadian organizations and Canadian corporations. Helle, I see you wanting to say something, and then
yes, and I think it's fantastic, because if you think about Canada, there's all cultures represented. It's the most diverse that I have lived in, right? And I lived in New York as well. So you have all of these perspectives. But I think the reason why we're also talking global is because companies in Canada, as well as many other places, they have supply chain that are outside of Canada. They have customers that's outside. They have subsidiaries that's outside of Canada. And having that you need to have that global understanding, in my mind, of what's happening, and going back to why we have this global network of both executives and directors that are learning together and learning from other global leaders, because I think that's where you can move the needle and move forward and be successful as a business and as a business leader.
Thanks, Helle. And from your perspective, David?
Yeah, I just was going to say we're a heavily resource-dependent economy. So we've got some of the largest mining companies in the world. When I was chairman of one of them, we had operations in 7 different countries. Oil and gas is another huge exportable item that we have. Wheat, grains, supplies. So Canada's always been hugely export-oriented, and has had to know where its customers were and had to know where the other cultures lay. So that's another sort of deeply embedded characteristic of our country. And the other piece I would suggest is that the fastest growing form of business combinations are joint ventures. There were over 12,000 new ones last year. And that by its very definition takes you into a different culture, the culture of the other joint venture partner, let alone whether that partner's in a different nation. So this is something that companies have had to learn how to do. For the last 20 or 30 years, JVs have just exploded as a form of activity to enter new markets, to combine strengths, to do a whole bunch of different things. So yes, culturally, I think Canada has been very open and very diverse from the very beginning.
So the directors that you're training, are they mainly the listed organizations, or is it diverse? And then for those others, what codes do they use as their guidance for governance beyond the regulations?
Well, yeah, I take a poll of all the incoming classes, and it's pretty evenly spread through private equity, family companies, private companies, and other forms of adventure. Our governments deliver about half the goods and services in Canada are delivered through something called boards that are appointed by the government of Canada. So our rail company, our mortgage and housing corporation, which is 500 billion, everywhere. We have government involvement with boards of directors. So there's lots of different kinds of boards. They all have different kinds of challenges. And we try to work people pretty hard on understanding the other forms of governance in order that they can get some perspective on what their challenges are. So a not-for-profit is typically a board of 20 people, whereas a public company is typically a board of 12. The 20 are probably all big donors or stridently opposed to something or other, so the meetings can be hugely fractious. And learning about how you manage that meeting as a chair is probably as important to the chair of a small publicly traded company as any other learning there is. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization in all of our classes across different kinds of boards of directors.
And what code, is there a specific code for those non-listed or no?
No, it's all comply or explain. We have big debates every class. Do you want gender-based quotas or do you want to comply or explain? And generally speaking, the women in the class despise quotas because they don't want to be quotaized. No, I want to be selected for my capabilities as an individual to contribute to this entity. And I don't want a stamp on my back saying we had to have her because we have to meet our quotas. Yeah, so it's all comply or explain pretty much.
And is that comply or explain, is that, I'm just trying to understand the actual regulations. Is that in your Companies Act? I mean, these are for the non-listeds. What other guidance?
Mainly the securities regulators. Your Companies Act basically says you have a responsibility, a duty of care and a duty of fiduciary responsibility. And the rest of this is in the publicly traded markets regulatory framework.
And so the other companies that aren't traded, do they have a code or standard that they use?
No, they don't. No.
And that works?
I guess so. As I say, it's very difficult. Everything in the corporate governance world has been posited on publicly traded companies from Cadbury to the Day Report. And in that, and even then, largely into the big caps. So we have an S&P 250 in Toronto, but there's 7,000 firms listed on the venture exchange. So all the governance that's come out of the 90s and the early part of this century have been really based around large publicly traded companies. But as I say, the center of gravity of economic activities moved dramatically away from large publicly traded companies into other spheres. And those that are coming public with dual class shares increasingly to protect themselves from activism and short-termism. So the whole structure of capitalism in North America is dramatically underviewed by people who read newspapers and who study learned journals because it's just not available the same way that what's going on Wall Street is available second by second. But that matters less and less and less and has been doing for the last 25 years. That's why the number of publicly traded stocks is down by 50%, 50, not 5, 50%. There's half as many publicly traded companies today as there was in 1995.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, Hela, are you seeing that the organizations, that the people that are coming to your courses and that you see in your interactions with other directors across the world, are you seeing that they're trying to force? So it's the long tail. It's not these large listeds, it's the other organizations. Do you think this tail is going to be able to wag the dog when it comes to ESG and climate?
Well, I think it is happening all over the world. I think it has happened, as I said, with Fortune 500 companies that's joining us. It's private companies, private equity companies, investors, etc. I see it coming, and it might be because all of those that's coming to the competent board courses are those that say, "Oh, I see what's happening. I want to learn the ABC of ESG. I want to be able to provide that oversight. I want to be able to have what I call the passport to the future," right? So it might be that I'm seeing those, and I want to go back, David. You're totally right in terms of quotas and not, and I think that's the discussion we have had all around the world. I think it's the same men would probably not like to be saying, okay, quotas. We do have in Canada from, I think, back in 2020, where we had new disclosures in terms of both women in leadership positions, but also visible minorities, Aboriginal people, people with disabilities, etc. So we are actually putting things into the disclosure in that regard as well. And you know, you can argue, but unfortunately, it seems like unless there are some kind of quotas, that not that much is happening. But I see that now we're seeing a change, and perhaps because people recognize that this is valuable, right? This is not to say here's the picture and see this is diverse, but it's the diversity of thought. If that mindset, it's that integrated mindset and integrated thinking that you get by having different opinions around the boardroom table. Michael Tresco, that was the chair of Unilever when I worked with them, and when we started the competent boards, Michael once said to me, you know, my job as the chair is to ensure that all the questions around the boardroom table are answered. And he also said another thing I think is very important in this, because we're discussing a little bit short-term versus long-term. He once said, you know, the only way we get to the long-term decisions we want is by taking the right short-term decisions. And I think that's important. So it's not either or, it's making sure that you know your purpose, you know what good looks like, and then make the right short-term decisions. And that's when we're talking about transition plans, right? It's not going from A to F in one day. It is to say, what is the transition plan to get there? And I think that's what I'm seeing from those people that are coming to the ESG and climate competent boards programs from all over the world. That's what they see. They see we want to be part of that future and drive that transition.
And they're prepared to invest to get there.
Yeah, I mean, as I saw in one of the comments here, yes, it is. It's inexpensive. Where was it? I saw that competent boards programs are very inexpensive. Thank you for that tip. Maybe I should look at that. But yes, I wanted to make sure that we could, you know, and that's also why I wrote the book Stewards of the Future, and kind of like brought all this in. I want to make sure that we get this insight out to as many as possible, because I believe that is, you know, the way that we get to the companies we want, we get to the world we want, we get to having hope for all the young people that's right now looking at us and saying, can we trust you, right? So that's where I'm hoping to get that mindset and get leaders, and I know it's working because that's what I'm being told, to ask those right questions, but not only to ask the questions, but also understanding what are the responses that look good. What is really we want, and drive that companies and drive our companies with the values. Know when to speed, you know, say, okay, we need to speed up. Know when we should say, okay, let's put on the brake. It's the board of directors that are choosing, hiring, firing, the CEO in that, and that's such an important role. We need to make sure that we have that in place, and we need to make sure that we have the right governance mindset in
absolutely. So definitely, I think, you know, the people that are coming to your program, you are supporting those people who kind of preaching to the converted, should I say. Those are the people who really want to change, who want to know how to change, who are promoting and supporting that thinking. But, and I want to swing to another aspect, and I saw it coming through on the questions, is about the questions of ethics, because we see so many board failures around that are driven through poor ethics. And maybe just to swing back to you, David, in terms of ethics, how do you go about teaching ethics? You know, I know that there's, you know, discipline around it, and but really this is people's behavior. How do you instill ethics in your directors and your programs?
Good question. We give them what we call director's dilemmas. What are you going to do now? So if you're on the board of Rio Tinto Zinc, having just blown up a 30,000-year-old sacred site in Australia of the Aboriginals, you've got another great potential mine in Oak Flats, which is traditional Sioux Indian land in the United States. What are you going to do? And you just send them out and come back and have a chat. I think ethics, to some extent, I don't know whether it's born into you or whether it's bred into you afterwards, but we certainly had a ton of failures. I think a lot of those failures are less ethical failures than oversight failures. So Wells Fargo, for example, I don't think there's a director on a Wells Fargo board that ever visited a bank branch. And yet all of a sudden they wake up one morning and find that their bank has been defrauding tens of millions of customers for over a decade. That's a failure of board process. No one on that board, let's assume 9 out of 10 are ethical human beings. They don't want to cheat the customers, but it was systematically happening and they never got out of the boardroom. So one of my big edicts to anybody I have a chance to interact with is you've got to understand the operating culture of your company. You got to get out of the boardroom. In the boardroom, you eat what you're fed, and the CEOs in some companies will feed you what they want you to believe. That may not be the operating ethos of the company. And it cost Wells Fargo, I don't know, 35 billion. BP's another one with the Gulf explosion. That's cost them 60 billion euros. Not a single director visited Atlantic Richfield. Not a single director of Boeing went on the floor to understand the culture of McDonnell Douglas was very different from the culture of Boeing when they merged. So time after time, I think it's a failure of boards in their oversight roles rather than a sort of an ethical collapse of a group of people. Yeah, that's where I'd be.
Interesting.
Process.
And I know, Helle,
get out of the boardroom. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Helle. And I know you're itching to say something, but how do you get out of the boardroom, especially if you're a paid for director?
Well, it depends on your business, but it's easy. If it's a business that's technically complex, like building an aircraft in Boeing, go to the Farnham Air Show and see Aerospatiale and go with the executives and understand what's happening. If it's a grocery chain, check the kids in the Sobeys grocery, who are fifth generation now, are encouraged at age 7 to go and help pack groceries or to be on the back receiving dock. So it depends. If you're a bank director, get out and visit a branch. Say, hi, my name is David Beatty. I happen to be on the board of your bank. And just like to have a chat. They're thrilled to see you and you can chat with them. You pick up symbols. Well, what are you doing about this? And have you heard about that? If you're walking around a mine site, you're looking at the safety performance. And if somebody's talking about cost cutting and somebody's not wearing a safety harness or a hard hat, you pick that up as a director. You pick up a lot of social clues. You just got to get out of the boardroom if you're going to be a value-added, effective director and prevent. This isn't even being value-added, it's preventing ethical lapses within the company if it happens that your leader, him or herself, happens to be running a bit of a fraud.
That sounds like a governance principle to me. That isn't in any governance code. Is actually a board needs to get out and to get out and about.
Yeah. And not the other side of it is you eat what you're fed in the boardroom. So, you've got to get out to understand the true operating culture. You have to be out in the field talking to people.
And often directors see that they're getting compensated on a per meeting basis.
No, there's annual fees. No, they're annual fees. But the other thing I'd agree with Helle is that the whole investor relations functions moved from IR as a C-suite operation into the boardroom. So most Canadian and American directors are now out talking to the shareholders they have and talking to the shareholders they've not got and talking to the activist funds who might be interested in them. So at least they can get their point of view as to what they're trying to do with the assets under their stewardship understood by the external world and listen to them. So that function is dramatically different in the last 20 years. And I don't think that's going away at all. In fact, I think it's intensifying.
Helle, so you did want to say.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We need boots on the ground, right? Like David, you're saying. But the other thing, and Chad Holliday, who was the chair of Shell and was the chair of Bank of America, is also one of our faculty. Chad was saying, you also need to go out and listening to show your employees and especially the young employees. So he had, lunch with those young employees and said, if they don't feel we're moving right and fast enough, they're going to be out of here. And the other thing that I perhaps will give that he said that is kind of like ask the questions to those people at different places. What are the taboos here? and what are the totems? What can get you fired here, right? That's why you start getting what is the real culture that's happening? What is this Fingerspitzengefühl, to use German? But kind of like that's happening. So that can bring that back to the boardroom. I also think that inviting those younger voices into the boardroom, and I know Professor Mervyn King and I have been talking about that and it's kind of like, how do we ensure that we get those younger voices in? How do we ensure that we get that, different mindset that can question us? Because it's what David is saying. I don't think that's a director that wakes up and saying, oh, let me go in and do something unethical. I mean, hopefully not. I think what it is, and the reason why, again, I'm doing what I'm doing, is that it's hard to make informed decisions if you're not informed. And most of us are not informed about ESG and climate and human rights and all the laws and regulations coming up. So that's why, hopefully informing and helping getting that into, so you can make those wise decisions. That's both wise in the short and the long term.
And we just got a few seconds. There's a whole nother issue that's sweeping across boards that I'm working with Google on. I call it the Digital Tsunami. Google has an evangelist force of 65 people who do nothing but talk to CEOs about the transformative effect of the fourth industrial revolution. Their estimate is that 50% of the S&P 500 companies today will be gone in 7 years, not absorbed in a merger, but simply annihilated by something that hits them in the back of the head. And so I've been working with them to try to figure out what our board's doing in response. And one of the things they have not been doing is changing their age distribution. The average age of a corporate director in the S&P 500 is still 64. And we tried to find out how many directors are under 40. We couldn't. We found out that under 50, it's 4%. So if you think that people more comfortable with digitization and the new technologies that are sweeping over us would be younger, which I would assume to be the case, boards are not moving at all. In terms of skill sets, we've done tests on searching for what kind of skills people have. We have 20 words we would look for to indicate that they might have some capability in artificial intelligence, machine learning, digitization. That number is now up to about 40% of all active directors on the S&P 500, same in Canada and the same on the FTSE 100 in the UK. So there's some movement in terms of skill sets to try to cope with the digital tsunami, but it is going to wipe out 100 different boards pretty fast, and they're not going to see it coming. So I changed the word. CEO no longer stands for Chief Executive Officer, it stands for Chief External Officer, and that's AJ Lafley at P&G. My job isn't to run 16 multinational global businesses. That's what my direct reports do. My job is to figure out what's going to put us out of business. I'm the Chief External Officer. And that has basically not been incorporated in any boards that I can see in a systematic way. There are lots of I've got 10 different tools I encourage boards to use to get out, but we're way behind the curve, and that's going to annihilate lots of companies, Carolyn.
What is happening in Canada around that? Is there specific, is Canada embracing the fourth industrial revolution? I know I was involved with AICD, the Australian Institute of Corporate Directors, Company Directors, and they've got a huge, actually a national government initiative to educate boards on the digital era and digital assets and cryptocurrencies and cryptography. And so there's really a push by the Australian government. Is something like that happening in Canada, that there's a push for nothing?
I don't see any government push at all.
Nothing.
There's a bit, but you're totally right. There's not enough. And Carolyn, in terms of when we're talking about responsible use of data, cybersecurity, metaverse, all of those things, and thinking the unthinkable, right? That's some of the things that we are bringing in, and we're bringing in those experts that are exactly that, those that thinking that and can ask those questions. And I think, again, that's what we need. We need to have those questions asked. You see, Dan, I think, was saying we need those tough questions. And that's what, that's what I can do. That's what all of those global board members that are joining us asking those tough questions, and then have that global network that you can get that insight from, and make sure that you think the unthinkable, as the good Nick Gowing, another of the faculty, is saying.
I think the non-financial factors, so everybody's talking about sustainability and non-financial factors, and the non-financial factors being environment, society, governance. It sounds to me like there's another non-financial factor that's about to, as you say, there's a tsunami, and that's technology, digital. So that is a non-financial factor, surely.
But it's not non-financial. Sorry, Caroline. We see it like that, but it is indeed financial, right?
Yeah, but so is ESG. It also has a financial impact.
Exactly. So it's kind of like, what is the outcome of all of these things we do? And I think that's where we need to think, not in silos, but how does all of these things fit together in an integrated? I mean, it's the reason why I'm, keep talking about integrated reporting, but an integrated mindset. Because if we think about things in silos, it's like, what are the impact of those different things we're doing? What's the outcome? I think that's where we can really change not only behaviors, but actually get to the success.
Thanks. I think we've just got 2 minutes left. So last comments, if I can start with Helle, last comments, if you wanted to land what people need to know about governance in Canada, just something, a takeaway in the culture of governance, or something to do with the governance of corporations in Canada, what would you say? What would the message be for the people on the call?
I would say that we are really, in terms of, if I start with the environment, social governance, with climate, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is now coming into the governance, both with the TCFD, diversity, with other matters. But perhaps the most is that Canada is this fantastic mosaic of so many cultures. And by leveraging that, we actually can have that not only governance, but good governance and the future of good corporate governance. And that's what I say in terms of being stewards of the future.
Thank you, Helle. And from your perspective, David?
Yeah, I think we have a natural heritage of diverse cultures, both in terms of our business outreach internationally and in terms of the people at home. And the other thing, the third point I would say, is we have a culture that I think is a sharing culture, that an idea generated in Nova Scotia can end up in Victoria, British Columbia pretty fast through the transmission of one director bringing a good idea to another boardroom. That's not typical in my view. I've served on over 40 different boards and a number of S&P 500 in the United States. And that is not typical of US practice. So I think Canada's got this triple gift. We're externally oriented economically. We have a hugely diverse natural population, and we have this social mobility of moving good ideas from place A to place B.
Thank you, David. So thank you very much, everyone. Sorry, Helle?
Sorry, I was going to say, David, is this when we say invest in Canada?
Yes, for sure. And that's what this is all about. So thank you very much for the two of you. Thank you, David, for your time. I really appreciate it. Helle, thank you so much. And thank you for all of our attendees today. The video will be put up on the event page, technology dependent today. And if you've asked for certificates of attendance, we will be distributing those during the course of the day. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And of course, we're on YouTube, so subscribe, like, share. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks,
Cheers. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Karen.